A 9-year-old girl runs through Bogotá's slums. Her white dress is stained with her parents' blood. Her hands clutch a computer chip containing secrets worth killing for, and behind her, trained assassins close in with orders to leave no witnesses. She doesn't cry. She doesn't scream. She calculates. Within minutes, she'll navigate rooftops like a parkour expert, swallow that chip to hide it from her pursuers, and stab a man twice her size through the hand with a toothbrush she sharpened into a weapon. This isn't a superhero origin story. This is Colombiana, and what you're witnessing is the birth of one of cinema's most ruthlessly efficient female assassins. Released in the late summer of 2011, Colombiana arrived at a fascinating cultural moment. The action genre was experiencing a significant shift. Female-led action films were still relatively rare outside of the Resident Evil franchise, and studios remained hesitant to greenlight revenge thrillers centered on women wielding the kind of brutal, unflinching violence typically reserved for male protagonists. Yet here comes Luc Besson, the mastermind behind Leon, The Professional, and La Femme Nikita, with another entry in his exploration of damaged women transformed into weapons. Directed by Olivier Megaton, who'd previously helmed Transporter 3, the film cast Zoe Saldana in a role that demanded she carry the entire picture on her shoulders. Fresh off her performance as Neytiri in Avatar and Uhura in the Star Trek reboot, Saldana was proving her action credentials, but Colombiana asked something different. Could she embody cold-blooded lethality while maintaining the emotional core that makes revenge stories resonate? The answer unfolds across 108 minutes of visceral action filmmaking that refuses to soften its edges. Colombiana tells a story of Cataleya Restrepo, named after a rare Colombian orchid, a detail that becomes her signature, her calling card, and ultimately the key to her revenge. The film operates on two timelines that couldn't be more different in tone, yet remain inextricably linked. In 1992, Bogotá, we meet young Cataleya, played with remarkable intensity by Amandla Stenberg, who witnesses the execution-style murder of her parents by Don Luis Sandoval's cartel enforcers. Her father, Fabio Restrepo, was a mid-level operative in the drug trade who made the fatal mistake of trying to leave that world behind. His attempt to walk away with information on Don Luis's operation stored on that smart media card triggers a brutal response. Marco, the cartel's chief enforcer portrayed by Jordi Mola, leads the kill squad that leaves Cataleya orphaned and traumatized. But trauma, in Colombiana's world, doesn't break people. It forges them into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. The film then jumps 15 years forward to present-day Chicago, where Cataleya has transformed into the assassin she promised her dying father she'd become. Working for her uncle Emilio, played by Cliff Curtis, in a performance that grounds the film's more fantastical element. She takes contracts as a professional killer while methodically working toward her true goal, drawing out Don Luis and Marco for a final confrontation. With each hit, she leaves behind her signature, a drawing of a Cataleya orchid, rendered in lipstick on the bodies or walls near her victim. It's a taunt, a breadcrumb trail designed to eventually reach Colombia and alert the men who murdered her family that someone is coming for them. What makes Colombiana fascinating isn't just its action sequence, though we'll dissect those in considerable detail, but rather how it exists at the intersection of multiple genre traditions. On one level, it's a straightforward revenge thriller in the tradition of Kill Bill or Man on Fire, stories where moral complexity takes a backseat to the primal satisfaction of watching the guilty punished. The film's emotional engine runs on a simple, powerful premise. A child watches her parents die and dedicates her entire life to making that right through violence. There's a purity to that motivation that transcends cultural boundaries. Audiences don't need complex moral arguments when they've seen a 9-year-old girl forced to flee through sewers while killers hunt her. We're on Cataleya's side from frame one, and the film never asks us to question whether her revenge is justified. Yet Colombiana also functions as a character study of obsession and the cost of vengeance. Cataleya isn't simply a killing machine. She maintains a relationship with Dany, played by Michael Vartan, a struggling artist who knows her as Jennifer and has no idea that the woman he's falling for is responsible for over 20 unsolved murders. These scenes, which could easily feel like obligatory romantic subplots, actually serve a crucial thematic purpose. They ask whether someone who's built their entire identity around revenge can ever truly connect with another person. Can Cataleya be both the assassin leaving orchid signatures and the woman who wants intimacy with someone who knows nothing of her past? The film suggests that these identities are fundamentally incompatible, and that tension drives much of the narrative's second act. The world Colombiana builds spans multiple continents and criminal undergrounds. In Bogotá, we're immersed in the violent hierarchy of Colombian drug cartels in the early 1990s, when organizations like the Medellin and Cali cartels were at the height of their power and brutality. The film doesn't romanticize this world or present it through the glamorous lens of something like Scarface. Instead, director Megaton shoots these early sequences with a documentary-like immediacy. The violence is sudden, close quarters, and messy. When Marco and his crew storm the Restrepo home, there's no action movie spectacle, just the cold efficiency of professional killers executing orders. Fabio tries to fight back, but he's outgunned and outnumbered. His wife Alicia, Cataleya's mother, attempts to buy her daughter time to escape and pays for that sacrifice with her life. These aren't heroic last stands. They're desperate, doomed attempts to protect what matters most. Chicago, by contrast, presents a different kind of criminal ecosystem. Here, Uncle Emilio operates a more organized operation, dealing in guns, contraband, and information. He's not a drug kingpin like Don Lewis, but rather a mid-level gangster who's carved out a sustainable niche in the city's criminal underworld. When young Cataleya arrives at his door, having somehow navigated her way from Colombia to the United States on her own, he's torn between family obligation and self-preservation. Taking in the daughter of a murdered cartel member puts him at risk. Training her to become an assassin, which she demands with chilling determination, puts his own family in even greater danger. Yet Emilio agrees, perhaps seeing in Cataleya's single-minded focus something he recognizes from his own past. Or maybe he simply understands that refusing her would only delay the inevitable. This girl will find a way to become a killer with or without his help. At least this way, he can try to keep her alive long enough to achieve her revenge. The film also weaves in a third perspective, that of FBI Special Agent James Ross, portrayed by Lenny James. Ross is investigating a series of seemingly unrelated murders that all share one bizarre detail. Each crime scene features the same orchid drawing. He's convinced these killings are connected, that there's a single perpetrator working with extraordinary skill and planning. But his investigation is hampered by the fact that the victims appear to have no connection to each other. Some are low-level criminals, others are businessmen with no obvious ties to organized crime. The pattern remains elusive until Dany's well-meaning decision to have Cataleya's photo run through a background check triggers an alert in law enforcement databases. Suddenly, Ross has a face to match to his orchid killer, and the hunt intensifies dramatically. What grounds all of these intersecting storylines is Zoe Saldana's performance in the lead role. She brings a physical commitment that elevates the film beyond standard action fare. Watch how she moves through the various infiltration sequences. There's a balletic quality to her motion, a precision that suggests countless hours of training, both Cataleya's fictional training with Emilio and Saldana's real-world preparation for the role. But what makes her portrayal truly compelling is the way she modulates Cataleya's emotional register. In assassination mode, she's almost mechanical, executing each step of her plans with zero hesitation or visible emotion. The killing itself doesn't excite or disturb her. It's simply work, necessary steps toward an ultimate goal. Yet in the scenes with Dany, we see fractures in that armor. She wants connection. She wants to be seen and known. But she can't allow herself that vulnerability because it threatens everything she's built her life around. The supporting cast fills out this world with lived-in performances that prevent the film from feeling like a one-person show. Cliff Curtis brings a weary pragmatism to Uncle Emilio, a man who understands the criminal world's rules and knows that Cataleya is breaking most of them. His warnings to her aren't about morality. He's hardly in a position to lecture anyone about ethics, but about survival. The attention she's drawing with her signature killings will eventually bring consequences not just for her but for everyone connected to her. Jordi Moll as Marco is less a fully developed character than an embodiment of cold professionalism in service to evil. He doesn't take pleasure in killing Cataleya's parents. It's not personal, it's business. That makes him more unsettling than if he were a sadistic villain. He's just doing his job, and his job happens to be murder. Colombiana's visual style reflects its split identity as both a slick action thriller and a more grounded character piece. Megaton, a protege of Besson who'd absorbed many of his mentor's stylistic trademarks, employs a kinetic camera that rarely stays still. During action sequences, the editing pace accelerates to match the on-screen chaos, cutting rapidly between perspectives to generate momentum and urgency. Some critics found this approach disorienting, arguing that the quick cuts sometimes obscured rather than clarified the action. Others praised how it captured the disorientation of combat, the way fights are experienced by participants as flashes of motion and impact, rather than choreographed dances. The truth probably lies somewhere between these positions. When Colombiana's action works, it genuinely thrills. When it doesn't, You wish the camera would pull back and let us appreciate the geography of a space or the flow of a sequence. But the film's most striking visual moments come in its quieter beats. There's a scene where Cataleya sits in a church, staring at a photo of her parents that Megaton shoots in warm, golden light filtering through stained glass. For just a moment, we see the 9-year-old girl she used to be, before trauma reshaped her into a weapon. These grace notes prevent Colombiana from becoming simply a succession of set pieces. They remind us that beneath the assassin's efficiency lies someone who lost everything and never truly recovered. The revenge she seeks isn't just about killing the men responsible. It's about trying to fill a void that violence can never actually fill. EW. The film's score, composed by Nathaniel Michaeli, blends electronic textures with orchestral elements to create a sound that's both modern and timeless. During infiltration sequences, the music takes on an almost industrial quality, all pulsing bass and mechanical rhythms that mirror Cataleya's methodical approach to her work. In moments of emotional vulnerability, strings emerge to add warmth and tragedy. The use of silence is equally important. Watch the opening assassination sequence at the Restrepo home. The score drops out completely, leaving only diegetic sounds, footsteps, gunshots, Cataleya's ragged breathing as she flees. That choice makes the violence feel immediate and brutal rather than stylized. Colombiana also engages, whether intentionally or not, with questions about female representation in action cinema. By 2011, we'd seen plenty of women in action roles, but most fell into a few specific categories. The sidekick who could fight but wasn't the main character, the femme fatale whose sexuality was as weaponized as her combat skills, or the superhero with powers that explained away the physical improbability of a smaller woman defeating larger men. Cataleya doesn't quite fit any of these molds. She's absolutely the protagonist, and the film never cuts away from her perspective for extended periods to follow male characters. Her sexuality exists. The relationship with Dany proves that, but is not her defining trait or primary weapon. And she has no superpowers. Just training and planning and an absolute unwillingness to stop until she achieves her goal. Does the film always handle this representation perfectly? Not necessarily. There are moments where the camera lingers on Saldanha's body in ways that feel more male-gazy than character-driven. The romantic subplot, while thematically relevant, sometimes slows the momentum in ways that make you wonder if a studio executive insisted on it to broaden the film's appeal. Yet overall, Colombiana gives us something relatively rare, a female revenge narrative that doesn't apologize for its protagonist's violence or attempt to soften her edges with redemptive subplots about her learning to forgive. Cataleya's arc isn't about discovering that revenge is wrong. It's about completing the revenge she's planned since she was 9 years old. Consequences be damned. The film's title itself carries significance worth unpacking. Colombiana means Colombian woman, but is also the name of the orchid species that becomes Cataleya's signature. In choosing this title, the film creates a direct link between the protagonist's identity and her homeland, suggesting that her quest for revenge is inseparable from her Colombian roots and the violence that shapes that nation's recent history. The Cataleya orchid is known for its beauty and rarity, characteristics that mirror Cataleya herself, someone who stands out precisely because she's extraordinary at what she does. But orchids are also delicate, requiring specific conditions to thrive. Remove them from their native environment, and they struggle. There's a metaphor there about Cataleya living in Chicago but never truly being able to put down roots, never able to bloom into a full life because she's transplanted herself into a world of violence and isolation. At its core, Colombiana asks a question that revenge films have been exploring since ancient Greek tragedy. What do you have left when vengeance is all you've lived for and you finally achieve it? The film doesn't rush to answer that question or pretend there's an easy resolution. Instead, it follows Cataleya through her methodical campaign of violence, watching as she eliminates everyone connected to her parents' murder with the same cold efficiency she brings to her contract kills. The orchid she leaves behind serves multiple purposes. It's a signature, yes, but also a message. I was here, I did this, and I'm coming for you next. Each killing is both an end and a means, simultaneously satisfying in itself and a step toward the final confrontation. By the time Colombiana reaches its climactic sequences, we've spent nearly 2 hours with a protagonist who's never wavered from her purpose. Unlike revenge stories where the hero has second thoughts or learns important lessons about the futility of violence, Cataleya remains locked in. She knows the cost. Uncle Emilio warns her repeatedly that her actions will bring consequences for everyone around her, and those warnings prove tragically prophetic when Don Luis's men massacre Emilio's entire family in retaliation. Even then, Cataleya doesn't question her path. If anything, these new deaths only fuel her determination. The film refuses to judge her for that single-mindedness, presenting it as neither heroic nor villainous, but simply as the inevitable result of what she became when she watched her parents die. This is the world of Colombiana, a place where 9-year-olds become assassins, where revenge is the only currency that matters, and where the beauty of an orchid masks the brutality of what it represents. It's a world painted in bold strokes, primary colors of violence, loss, and retribution, but rendered with enough attention to character and consequence to elevate it beyond simple exploitation. Over the next segments, we'll break down exactly how this film constructs its narrative, develops its characters, employs its technical craft, and ultimately asks whether revenge can ever truly be satisfying or if it only creates new cycles of violence that consume everyone involved. Cataleya's journey from traumatized child to lethal adult is the skeleton on which Colombiana builds its flesh, and understanding that journey requires us to look at every element, story, performance, cinematography, themes that makes this film tick. The opening chase through Bogotá's streets sets the template. Young Cataleya, played by Stenberg with remarkable maturity, doesn't run blindly. She calculates. She uses her size as an advantage, slipping through spaces adult pursuers can't follow. When cornered in a bathroom, she doesn't surrender. She weaponizes what she has available. That toothbrush through the assassin's hand isn't just shocking violence. It's the birth of her operational philosophy. Use what you have. Exploit every advantage. Never stop moving forward. 15 years later, adult Cataleya will execute elaborately planned hits with the same core principle. The details change. Instead of toothbrushes, she uses sophisticated weapons and technology, but the mindset remains identical. Trauma didn't break her that day in Bogotá. It taught her exactly who she needed to become. The jump from Bogotá in 1992 to present-day Chicago is more than just a time skip. It's a reveal of what 15 years of focused rage can do to a human being. The girl who once sprinted barefoot through cramped alleys has become a woman whose every step is calculated, whose daily routines are less about survival and more about precision. We meet the adult Cataleya, not as a grieving victim, but as a professional. She's not introduced through an emotional breakdown, a therapy session, or a heart-to-heart conversation. Instead, we see her mid-operation, embedded in a role already deep inside enemy territory. The film's choice here is clear. Cataleya's inner life is communicated through the way she works. One of the most striking elements of her new world is how ordinary it looks on the surface. She shares a home base with her uncle Emilio, who now functions as her handler, mentor, and the closest thing she has to family. Their relationship is complicated from the start. He's the one who taught her how to shoot, how to fight, how to disappear in a crowd. He also understands that every skill he passed along is sharpening a blade that was forged the night her parents died. When they argue, it's rarely about whether she should kill. It's about how she does it, how much attention she draws, and how close she's coming to getting both of them killed. In their cramped kitchen or cluttered office, you can feel the tension between paternal concern and criminal pragmatism. From a structural standpoint, this first act in Chicago does exactly what a revenge thriller needs to do. It lays out the rules of the protagonist's new reality. Cataleya has two lives running in parallel. In one, she's a contract killer, executing jobs chosen and negotiated by Emilio. In the other, she's quietly building a private campaign aimed squarely at Don Luis and Marco. The genius of her approach is that she uses one life to camouflage the other. Each contract hit becomes an opportunity to refine her craft, test her limits, and occasionally slip in kills that serve her personal vendetta. Emilio wants clean, efficient jobs that leave no trail. Cataleya, on the other hand, wants her enemies to see a pattern. That's where the orchids come in. The calling card she leaves behind at her crime scenes isn't a flourish, added late in her journey. It's a ritual she clearly planned years in advance. When she was a child, her father pointed out the Cataleya to her, connecting the flower to her name and her identity. As an adult, she transforms that memory into a signature. After a hit, she'll draw an orchid in lipstick on the victim's chest or nearby surfaces, a stylized emblem that turns a quiet assassination into a message. It's a contradiction at the heart of her methodology. She's too good at her job to leave sloppy evidence, but she's deliberately inserting a symbol that ties the murders together. That tension between professionalism and personal obsession is one of the key forces pushing the story forward. The film's early Chicago sequences often unfold like self-contained mini-heists. Rewatch Cataleya infiltrate high-security locations with a mix of athleticism, improvisation, and cold logic. In one operation, she uses air ducts to traverse a building, slipping through tight spaces that most assassins wouldn't even consider. In another, she poses as a drunk or disoriented woman to lower a guard's defenses, letting sexism become a weapon she can turn against those who underestimate her. These scenes serve multiple purposes at once. They entertain as set pieces, They establish her competence, and they show how comfortable she is, operating in the liminal spaces between identities, between legal and illegal worlds, between the ordinary and the lethal. At the same time, Act I quietly introduces the law enforcement perspective that will only grow more important as the narrative continues. Agent James Ross is brought into the picture as someone who notices what others have missed. This isn't just a string of unrelated killings. The orchid motif keeps showing up, a visual pattern that suggests intentionality. Ross isn't a super genius detective, but he's persistent, and persistence is exactly the kind of quality that makes him dangerous to someone like Cataleya. While she's focused on drawing out Don Lewis, she's inadvertently drawing Ross toward her as well. The film doesn't rush this clash. Instead, it plants the seeds of their eventual conflict by showing Ross collecting files, connecting dots, and slowly building a profile of a killer who operates with unusual discipline. Where many revenge thrillers place heavy emphasis on the protagonist's training, Colombiana largely skips the montage approach. We don't spend long sequences watching teenage Cataleya learn how to shoot or fight. Instead, we infer the training through the adult version of her we see in action. Her comfort with weapons, her fluency in manipulating urban environments, her ability to quickly improvise under pressure. These are the visible outcomes of years spent under Emilio's tutelage. This choice accelerates the pacing of the first act. Rather than pausing to show us how she became deadly, the film simply shows her being deadly and trusts us to fill in the gaps. Emotionally, however, that fast-forwarded transformation comes with a cost. Cataleya herself is guarded almost to the point of opacity. She doesn't monologue about her pain, she doesn't explain her ideology or confess the weight of her trauma to anyone around her. What we get instead are small, telling fragments. A quiet moment where she looks at an old photograph, the way her expression shifts when Emilio mentions her parents, the flicker of something almost like panic when anyone gets too close to the part of her life that she keeps sealed away. These glimpses are small, but they're crucial in the setup phase. If the film had made her entirely emotionless, the revenge would feel hollow. By letting us see the echo of that 9-year-old inside the assassin, Act 1 gives the later violence a sense of personal cost. One of the foundational ideas of this film is that Cataleya can't truly live as two different people forever. The first act in Chicago is almost a case study in how she tries. On one side, there's Cataleya, Emilio's niece, a ghost who moves through the underworld known only to a small circle of criminals. On the other, there's Jennifer, the woman who appears in Michael Vartan's life with no history she's willing to share. The way she compartmentalizes these identities is brutal and efficient. With Dany, she shows up, disappears, and refuses to answer questions. She never spends the night. She never lets him see where she lives. She never introduces him to family or friends because, by design, she doesn't really have any. Those early scenes between Cataleya and Dany are deliberately ordinary compared to the rest of the film. They're quieter, less stylized, almost awkward. For a lot of viewers, they can feel like the movie tapping the brakes, but on a character level, they're doing important work. This is where we see the central wound of Cataleya's existence. She wants something like normal human connection, but she has no idea how to allow it without endangering her mission and the people around her. When Dany asks basic questions about her past, her job, even her real name, she deflects, sometimes with gentle humor, sometimes with a hard edge. He mistakes her secrecy for mystery. The audience knows better. It's not flirtation. It's a survival mechanism. We also see that the lie she's constructed has a limited shelf life. Dany is not stupid, and the modern world is not kind to people who try to erase their past completely. Background checks, digital footprints, casual photos shared with friends, any one of these things can reveal cracks in the persona she's built. The film slowly tightens the screws as Dany's curiosity and frustration grow. He's not trying to expose her. He just wants to know who he's actually with. But wanting that knowledge leads him to make a decision that will ricochet through the rest of the story. He reaches out to someone to check her fingerprints against databases, hoping to finally understand the woman in his life. On the criminal side, Cataleya's relationship with Emilio is under even more strain. He's a man who has figured out how to navigate dangerous systems by keeping a low profile, by making himself too useful to destroy and too quiet to notice. She is doing the opposite. Every time she leaves an orchid, she's increasing the chances that police, federal agencies, or rival criminals will start connecting dots that lead straight back to Emilio's operation. From his perspective, her personal vendetta isn't just reckless, it's suicidal, and he's being dragged along with it. Their arguments, usually held in private corners of his office or home, revolve around that irreconcilable difference. For Emilio, survival is the goal. For Cataleya, survival is meaningless without revenge. This clash of priorities gives the first act its emotional stakes beyond the gunfire. It's not just that Cataleya wants to kill Don Luis and Marco, it's that her pursuit of them is poisoning the only relationships she has left. Emilio sees his business and his family, his wife, his children being put at risk by someone he loves but can't control. Cataleya, in turn, sees any suggestion of laying low as an insult to the promise she made at her father's deathbed. In her mind, asking her to stop hunting Don Luis is equivalent to asking her to betray her parents all over again. Once the story frames it that way, compromise becomes impossible. From a story structure perspective, Act 1 is doing a lot of quiet, heavy lifting here. It's establishing that every part of Cataleya's life is built on fragile foundations. Her romance is founded on lies. Her professional relationship with her uncle is fraying because their goals are no longer aligned. Her work as an assassin is leaving patterns in its wake, patterns that men like Ross are trained to notice. All of this tension is building toward the moment when those fragile compartments collapse into each other and the film shifts fully into its second act. Visually, the first act in Chicago uses space and framing to underline the double life theme. Cataleya is often shot alone, even when she's in a room with other people. In intimate scenes, the camera stays tight on her face, inviting us to search for emotion that she's trying desperately to suppress. In operations, the frame widens, emphasizing how small she looks in the massive structures she infiltrates. High-rise office towers, sprawling compounds, institutions that symbolize systems much larger than any one person. That contrast between intimate close-ups and wide establishing shots suggests a woman who is both intensely focused and fundamentally isolated. The pacing of this act also reflects her mindset. In the assassination sequences, the editing is sharp, almost staccato, mirroring the way she breaks tasks into precise, executable steps. The time with Dany, by comparison, lingers a bit longer on conversations, on silence, on the awkwardness of two people who aren't on the same page about what their relationship even is. Neither rhythm is allowed to fully dominate the film. Instead, they're intercut, reminding us that Cataleya can't fully exist in either mode without the other bleeding through. All of this setup is necessary for the plot engine to kick into high gear. Without understanding how carefully she has separated her lives and how fragile those separations actually are, the later betrayals and tragedies risk feeling like arbitrary turns. By the time Act I reaches its tipping point, we've seen enough of Cataleya's world to understand that a single misstep, a single careless piece of information, could cause a chain reaction that no one can control. And that's exactly where the story is heading. The turning point begins not with a gunshot, but with a seemingly mundane act of curiosity. Dany, tired of loving a woman who lives like a ghost, quietly asks for help identifying her. He doesn't imagine he's lighting a fuse. In his mind, he's just trying to put a real name and history to the person he keeps waking up next to. That small decision, made out of frustration and longing rather than malice, reaches far beyond his intentions. It sends Cataleya's fingerprints and photo into the same systems that Agent Ross has been combing through for months, searching for any trace of the elusive orchid killer. When Ross finally gets a match, the investigation that's been simmering in the background surges forward. The string of meticulous, seemingly disconnected murders suddenly has a face and a story. He doesn't just see a hit woman, he sees a survivor of a cartel massacre whose parents died in a way that lines up disturbingly well with older intelligence reports. The orchid motif stops being an abstract clue and becomes part of a larger narrative. A child who escaped violence has grown into someone who brings it to others with surgical focus. Ross's pursuit changes from a puzzle-solving exercise into something far more pressing. There's a name, a history, and a pattern, and now he has to act before more bodies hit the ground. For Cataleya, the first signal that her carefully controlled existence is unraveling doesn't come with sirens. It arrives through Emilio. He hears whispers, senses that attention is tightening around their operation, and confronts her with a mixture of fury and fear. The orchids, the theatrical flourishes she's been leaving behind as messages to Don Luis, are no longer abstract symbols of defiance. They're breadcrumbs that law enforcement is now actively following. In his eyes, she hasn't just endangered herself, she's painted a target on the backs of everyone who shelters her. The argument that follows is one of the most emotionally charged in the film. He tells her plainly that this path will end with either a bullet or a cell. She counters with the only truth that matters to her: if Don Luis dies, the cost is acceptable. The crucial thing about this confrontation is that neither of them is entirely wrong. Emilio is correct that the increased visibility of her work will draw the kind of pressure they've spent years avoiding. Cataleya, however, sees any life lived in hiding without payback as a betrayal of the dead. The story uses this clash to crystallize its central moral tension. Is survival enough, or does justice, even violent extrajudicial justice, justify risking everything? There's no neat resolution. They don't find common ground. Instead, This argument becomes a fault line that will split their world apart in the next stretch of the narrative. The moment Don Lewis realizes someone is systematically targeting people connected to him, the story shifts from slow burn to open conflict. He has been living under government protection, shielded by corrupt arrangements and distance. The orchid-marked bodies, however, make it clear that distance is no longer protection. Whoever is behind these killings knows his network, understands his past, and is willing to announce each strike with the same emblem. To a man obsessed with control and reputation, this isn't just an operational threat, it's an insult that demands an answer. His response is characteristically brutal. Rather than simply tightening security or going deeper underground, he orders a counterstrike that aims to wipe out Cataleya's entire support system. Marco, the man who once led the squad that murdered her parents, is again given the task of making a problem disappear. The echoes are intentional. Years ago, he kicked in the Restrepo family's door. Now, he's coming for the surrogate family who took that orphan in. The circular nature of this violence underlines one of the film's darker ideas. Cycles of retribution rarely end. They just change target. The attack on Emilio's household is a brutal punctuation mark after all the warnings he voiced. The domestic spaces we've seen in quieter moments, family meals, casual conversations, arguments over business, suddenly become battlegrounds. Walls that once separated crime from everyday life are shredded by gunfire. For Cataleya, this is more than a tactical blow. It's a replay of her original trauma, delivered with calculated cruelty. Years after watching her parents die because of cartel decisions, she now sees her uncle and his family punished for her refusal to back down. The very thing Emilio feared, that her pursuit of Don Luis would bring death to his doorstep, comes true with devastating clarity. This massacre marks the point of no return. Up to this moment, there was at least a theoretical version of the story where Cataleya could cut ties, vanish, or somehow negotiate a different path. Once Emilio and his loved ones are executed, that possibility evaporates. The revenge she sought for her parents now extends to the only other family she had. Every restraint, every limit, every rule about staying quiet and hidden collapses. The mission that once had a long-term methodical timeline becomes immediate. Don Luis is no longer an eventual target. He becomes the only target. Parallel to this, Ross's pursuit intensifies. The same massacre that shatters Cataleya's personal world also presents law enforcement with a clearer picture of what's happening. Dead criminals, a destroyed home connected to a known associate, and the same orchid motif. These aren't random occurrences anymore. They form a map that points directly to a single person. Ross doesn't necessarily understand the depth of Cataleya's personal losses, but he does see that they're dealing with someone who will not stop voluntarily. That realization shifts his role from investigator to hunter. Act 2, then, becomes a collision course set in motion by choices made in different corners of this world. Dany's need for answers triggers official recognition. Emilio's warnings, ignored out of necessity, play out in the worst possible way. Don Luis's pride demands a theatrical reprisal. Cataleya's grief, compounded and renewed, hardens into something even more ferocious than before. None of these developments happen in isolation. They're cause and effect chains that lock the story into a path where surrender or compromise no longer feel like options any character would plausibly take. As the second act unfolds, what used to be discrete operations turn into open declarations. Cataleya is no longer satisfied with leaving symbols alongside quietly staged assassinations. She starts planning assaults that are designed to send an unmistakable message. She knows where Don Luis is hiding, she can reach him, and she will dismantle every layer of protection between them. The careful balance of her early missions, precision over spectacle, gives way to a willingness to embrace larger risks, because she has already lost everything that made caution worthwhile. Structurally, this is where the narrative fully embraces the epic side of its revenge story. The stakes are no longer limited to one woman and her internal demons. Her actions now reverberate across criminal networks, government protection schemes, and federal investigation. Each move she makes forces someone else. Ross, Don Luis, Marco too, respond in ways that escalate the situation even further. The city ceases to be just a backdrop and becomes the chessboard where all these pieces collide. By the end of this escalation phase, Cataleya isn't just an assassin with a private vendetta. She has become a destabilizing force in multiple systems that rely on secrecy and balance. Don Luis's world is no longer secure. Ross's world is no longer theoretical. and Cataleya's world, already defined by loss, has been reduced to a single, blazing objective: finish what began in Bogotá, no matter how much blood it takes. If you're ready, next I'll continue with Segment 4, Act 3, Final Hunt and Resolution, covering the assault on Don Luis's stronghold, the last confrontation with Marco, and how the film resolves Cataleya's long pursuit. There's a point in every revenge narrative where planning gives way to pure forward momentum, where strategy becomes instinct, and the protagonist stops calculating odds because the mission has consumed everything else. Colombiana reaches that threshold as Cataleya prepares for the final assault. She's no longer operating within the framework of professional hits arranged by Emilio or carefully timed strikes designed to provoke but not expose. This is total commitment. The woman who once moved through cities like smoke, unnoticed and untraceable, now walks directly into the crosshairs of both law enforcement and the cartel, because staying hidden no longer serves her purpose. The film's third act opens with Cataleya understanding that Don Luis, despite his protection arrangements with certain government factions, is not actually unreachable. Corrupt deals and safe houses only work when the person you're hiding can afford to stay passive. Don Luis, however, has been drawn into reactive mode by the systematic elimination of his associates and the psychological warfare of those orchid signatures. His anger and pride have made him visible in ways that years of cautious maneuvering never did. Cataleya's strategy all along wasn't just to kill people connected to him. It was to make him feel vulnerable enough that he'd either come out of hiding or consolidate his remaining forces in a location she could target. That location becomes the focal point of the film's climax, a heavily fortified compound where Don Luis has gathered his remaining loyalists, including Marco. It's not a random safe house or a government facility. It's a space designed specifically to repel the kind of infiltration Cataleya specializes: multiple layers of security, armed guards at every checkpoint, surveillance systems covering every angle. On paper, it's suicide to attempt a solo breach. But the film has spent 2 acts establishing that Cataleya doesn't think in terms of acceptable losses to herself. She thinks in terms of mission completion. If getting to Don Luis requires walking through a gauntlet that might kill her, then that's the path she'll take. The assault sequence itself is where Colombiana fully commits to its identity as an action thriller rather than a slow burn character study. Megaton stages the infiltration as a series of escalating confrontations, each one removing another barrier between Cataleya and her target. She enters the compound not through stealth alone, but through a combination of preparation, improvisation, and sheer aggression. Walls that seemed impenetrable become navigable once she's willing to trigger alarms and force her way through rather than slipping past unnoticed. The change in approach reflects her internal state. There's no tomorrow that needs protecting, no cover identity that requires preservation. This is the conclusion, and subtlety has given way to inevitability. What makes these sequences more than just spectacle is the way the film intercuts them with the simultaneous efforts of Agent Ross and his team, who are converging on the same location from a different direction. Ross has figured out that Cataleya's target is Don Luis, and he knows that if she reaches him first, his investigation ends with more corpses and 0 answers. His goal isn't to protect Don Luis, a man whose crimes are well documented, but to stop the cycle of violence before it consumes everyone in its path. The irony, of course, is that Ross's intervention, meant to prevent bloodshed, only complicates an already chaotic situation and forces Cataleya to navigate threats from multiple directions. Inside the compound, the confrontation with Marco becomes the film's most personal moment of violence. This is the man who led the squad into her childhood home, who murdered her mother in front of her, who has existed in her mind as a symbol of everything she lost. When they finally face each other, there's a recognition on his part. He remembers the girl, understands who she's become, and knows why she's there. For Marco, this is the past catching up in a form he never anticipated. He assumed the child who escaped that night would either die in the streets of Bogotá or fade into obscurity. Instead, she turned herself into the one thing he couldn't ignore: a threat. Their fight is brutal and efficient, stripped of the choreographed elegance that sometimes defines action cinema. It's 2 people trying to kill each other with whatever tools are within reach, and the film doesn't romanticize the violence. Cataleya doesn't deliver a triumphant speech or pause to savor the moment. She simply ends him. The act itself is less cathartic than it is mechanical. A task completed, a name crossed off a list that has defined her entire adult life. The satisfaction the audience might expect from this moment is muted by how coldly it's executed. Revenge, the film suggests, doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like exhaustion. Don Luis's death follows a similar trajectory. When Cataleya finally reaches him, he's not a towering figure of menace. He's a man who has run out of places to hide and people to hide behind. The film doesn't give him a grand villain monologue or a last-minute revelation that reframes the story. He's simply the final obstacle, and she removes him with the same cold focus she's applied to every other target. There's no closure in his death. No sense that killing him has healed the wound that's driven her for 15 years. It's just done. Once the primary targets are eliminated, the film faces a more difficult question. What happens to a protagonist whose entire identity has been built around a goal that no longer exists? Cataleya has spent more than half her life preparing for and executing this revenge. With Don Luis and Marco dead, the mission that gave her purpose is complete. But completion doesn't equal resolution, and Colombiana is clear-eyed about the wreckage left in the wake of her success. The immediate aftermath of the compound assault is chaos. Bodies are scattered throughout the structure, law enforcement is closing in, and Cataleya is injured. Not fatally, but enough to underscore that she's human and that this final push has taken a physical toll. The film doesn't linger on the carnage in a way that glorifies it. Instead, there's a stillness to these moments, a sudden absence of the kinetic energy that defined the action sequences. What's left is quiet devastation and the reality that the people Cataleya cared about, her parents, Emilio, his family, are still gone. Killing their murderers didn't bring them back. Ross, arriving too late to prevent the deaths but in time to witness the aftermath, represents the law's attempt to impose order on a situation that has already spiraled beyond any institutional framework. He's faced with a choice: pursue Cataleya as a serial killer who has left a trail of bodies across multiple jurisdictions, or acknowledge that the people she killed were themselves criminals whose actions set this entire cycle in motion. The film doesn't give Ross an easy out here. He's not corrupt or willing to simply look the other way, but he's also confronted with the limitations of a justice system that failed to hold Don Luis accountable through legal means. The resolution between Ross and Cataleya isn't a dramatic showdown. It's something quieter and more ambiguous. He knows who she is, what she's done, and why she did it. She knows that he has the authority to arrest her and the evidence to ensure she spends the rest of her life in prison. What happens instead is a moment of mutual recognition. They both understand that the law couldn't deliver the justice Cataleya sought, and that her version of justice, while effective, has destroyed her in ways that incarceration never could. The film leaves their final exchange open-ended, refusing to confirm whether she escapes, surrenders, or simply disappears into the same kind of shadow life she's been living all along. Dany, too, remains a loose thread. The man who loved Jennifer without knowing Cataleya has been swept into a nightmare he never chose. His decision to run a background check, made out of love and curiosity, helped trigger the chain of events that led to multiple deaths. The film doesn't absolve him of responsibility, but it also doesn't vilify him. He's a civilian who got too close to something he couldn't possibly understand, and by the time he realizes the full scope of what Cataleya is, it's far too late to extract himself cleanly. Whether they have any future together is left deliberately unclear, another casualty of a life built on lies and violence. What Colombiana ultimately presents in its final act is a version of revenge that feels pyrrhic. Cataleya achieves everything she set out to do. Don Luis is dead. Marco is dead. The cartel that destroyed her family has been crippled, but the cost includes the only surrogate family she had, the exposure of her identity to law enforcement, and the loss of any chance at a normal life. The 9-year-old who swore revenge at her father's deathbed got what she wanted, but the adult who carried out that promise is left with nothing but the memory of violence and an uncertain future. The film's closing moments don't offer easy redemption or a clear path forward. Cataleya doesn't retire to a quiet life, nor does she die in a blaze of glory that would frame her revenge as heroic sacrifice. Instead, she exists in a liminal space, alive but haunted, free but isolated, victorious but empty. It's a more honest ending than many revenge thrillers allow themselves. The story acknowledges that some wounds don't heal just because you've killed the people who caused them. Sometimes, revenge is just another form of loss dressed up as justice. The final image we're left with? Whether it's Cataleya walking away from the compound, disappearing into a crowd, or sitting alone in some anonymous space, carries the weight of everything that came before. She's no longer the child fleeing through Bogotá's streets, but she's also not free of that moment. The orchid she leaves behind at each crime scene was always meant to be a message to her enemies, but in the end, it also becomes a marker of her own inability to move beyond the past. Every kill brought her closer to Don Luis, but it also locked her further into an identity built entirely around trauma and retribution. The third act, then, completes the narrative arc. Not with triumph, but with a question. The film refuses to answer definitively. Was it worth it? Did the revenge she spent 15 years planning and executing actually give her what she needed, Or did it just perpetuate the cycle of violence that killed her parents in the first place? Colombiana leaves that tension unresolved because there's no clean answer. For some viewers, Cataleya's success will feel like justice. For others, the bodies she leaves behind and the life she destroys, including her own, will feel like tragedy. The film holds space for both readings, refusing to simplify the moral complexity of a story that begins with a child's trauma and ends with an adult's vengeance. We'll move into segment 5, Character Study, examining the psychological layers of Cataleya and the ensemble that surrounds her. To understand Cataleya Restrepo as a character, you have to start with the fracture. Most protagonists in revenge narratives undergo transformation. A catalyst event changes who they are, and they become something new in response. Cataleya's story is different because the transformation happens so early and so completely that we never really meet the person she might have been. The girl running through Bogotá at 9 years old is already being reshaped by trauma in real time. By the time we encounter her as an adult, the original person is gone, replaced by someone who exists almost entirely in relation to a promise made over her father's body. That's not character development in the traditional sense. It's character erasure, and Zoe Saldana's performance has to communicate both the absence and the ghost of what was lost. Watch how she carries herself in the Chicago sequences. There's a fluidity to her movement that speaks to years of physical conditioning, but there's also a rigidity in her interactions with other people. When she's on a job, every gesture is purposeful, controlled, economical. There's no wasted motion, no hesitation, no visible fear. But when she's with Dany, pretending to be someone who could have a normal relationship, the performance becomes more effortful. She's mimicking behaviors she's observed but never truly internalized. The smiles don't quite reach her eyes. The laughter sounds practiced. She's playing the role of a woman capable of intimacy, but the script underneath is one she's memorized rather than felt. Saldana's physicality does a lot of the storytelling work that dialogue can't. In action sequences, she moves with a balletic precision that makes violence look almost artistic, but the artistry is in the efficiency rather than the flourish. She doesn't pose after a kill or linger over the aftermath. She completes the task and moves immediately to the next step in the plan. That relentless forward momentum reflects how Cataleya processes the world, as a series of obstacles between her and the goal. People aren't relationships to nurture. They're either assets, threats, or irrelevant. The only exception to this calculus is her family. First her parents, then Emilio, and even those connections are filtered through the lens of her mission. The trauma that created her isn't depicted as something she's working through or healing from. It's the foundation of her identity. Other revenge films often include moments where the protagonist questions whether they become as bad as the people they're hunting, whether the violence has corrupted them. Colombiana largely skips that introspection. Cataleya doesn't seem to worry about moral corruption because she doesn't view herself as having fallen from some higher state. She became what she needed to become, and the person she was before that night in Bogotá might as well have died alongside her parents. There's a coldness to that acceptance, but also a kind of clarity. She's not conflicted about her choices because she sees them as the only possible response to what was done to her. Yet the film also shows us moments where the mask slips, where the controlled exterior cracks just enough to reveal the wreckage beneath. The scene where she visits her parents' graves isn't played for melodrama. She doesn't break down sobbing or deliver a monologue to the headstones. Instead, she stands in silence, and Saldana lets us see something in her expression that's absent from the rest of the film: vulnerability. It's brief, a window that closes almost as soon as it opens, but it's enough to remind us that the assassin we've been watching is also a daughter who never stopped grieving. The orchid she places on the grave is the same symbol she uses at crime scenes, collapsing the distinction between memorial and threat, love and violence. Cliff Curtis's portrayal of Emilio Restrepo operates on a different register entirely. Where Cataleya is all forward motion and compressed emotion, Emilio is hesitation and regret wrapped in pragmatic criminality. He's a man who made his peace with being a criminal a long time ago, but he never signed up to be the architect of an assassin. When 9-year-old Cataleya arrives on his doorstep demanding that he teach her to kill, he's caught between familial duty and self-preservation. The film doesn't show us his internal debate in that moment, but Curtis's performance throughout the movie carries the weight of a decision he knows was probably wrong but couldn't bring himself to refuse. Emilio functions as the story's voice of caution, the character who keeps pointing out that Cataleya's approach is unsustainable. Every time she leaves an orchid, he sees it as another step toward disaster. He's not wrong. His warnings are grounded in a lived understanding of how criminal ecosystems work. You survive by being invisible, by making yourself useful but not indispensable, by never drawing more attention than you can handle. Cataleya is doing the opposite of all that. She's announcing herself, making herself a priority target for both law enforcement and rival criminals. From Emilio's perspective, it's not bravery. It's recklessness, born from an obsession she's never been willing to let go of. But Curtis also plays Emilio as someone who understands, on some level, why Cataleya can't stop. He was there that night, or at least close enough to know what happened. He took in a traumatized child who'd watched her parents executed and somehow navigated her way from Colombia to the United States alone. That kind of survival instinct doesn't just evaporate because someone offers you a safe home and regular meals. It metastasizes into something harder. When he trains her, when he introduces her to the tools of violence, he's not creating a killer. He's just giving form to something that was already taking shape inside her. The guilt that Curtis threads through his performance comes from recognizing that he facilitated her self-destruction even as he was trying to protect her. Their dynamic is one of the film's most compelling relationships because it's built on mutual love and mutual frustration. Emilio loves Cataleya as the daughter of his brother, as the child he raised, as family. But he also resents her for dragging him into a conflict he didn't choose and endangering the family he's built. Cataleya loves Emilio as the man who saved her and gave her the skills she needed, but she also resents him for constantly asking her to abandon the one thing that gives her life meaning. Neither of them can fully meet the other where they are, and that gap widens until it becomes a chasm that violence eventually fills. The massacre of Emilio's family is the film's cruelest validation of his fears. Everything he warned Cataleya about comes to pass. The attention she drew, the pattern she created, the enemies she provoked. They all converge on his home with lethal efficiency. Curtis doesn't get a big death scene where he delivers final wisdom or forgives her for what happened. Instead, the audience is left to imagine his last moments, knowing that he died understanding exactly why it was happening, and knowing that Cataleya would blame herself but still wouldn't stop. That absence of closure is part of the film's larger thesis. Revenge doesn't pause for grief, and the collateral damage doesn't get narrative resolution. Michael Vartan's Dany represents the part of Cataleya's life that exists in total denial of reality. He's an artist, a man whose world is defined by self-expression and emotional authenticity, and he falls for a woman who is entirely performative in his presence. The relationship is built on a foundation that can't support the weight of truth. Every moment they spend together, Cataleya is lying not just about her name or her job, but about the fundamental question of who she is. Dany believes he's dating someone mysterious and elusive, but ultimately knowable. The audience sees someone whose real self is so consumed by trauma and violence that the person Dany thinks he loves might not exist at all. Vartan plays Dany as earnest and occasionally naive, which makes him both sympathetic and slightly frustrating. He wants depth and connection, but he's also willing to overlook massive red flags because he's infatuated. When she refuses to tell him where she lives, when she disappears for days without explanation, when she dodges every personal question, he interprets these as quirks rather than warnings. Part of that is willful blindness. He doesn't want to see what's actually happening because it would shatter the fantasy he's constructed. Part of it is simply that the truth is so far outside his frame of reference that he couldn't imagine it even if he tried. The decision to have Dany run a background check on Cataleya is where his role shifts from romantic subplot to narrative catalyst. It's not malicious. He's not trying to expose her to authorities or invade her privacy out of cruelty. He's just exhausted by the secrecy and wants to know who he's actually with. That understandable human desire becomes the mechanism that unravels everything. His fingerprint request pings law enforcement databases, connects Cataleya to the orchid killings, and sets Agent Ross on her trail with renewed urgency. Dany becomes complicit in her downfall without ever intending to, and the film uses that to explore how ordinary actions in one person's life can have catastrophic consequences in another's. What's interesting about Dany's arc is that the film never gives him a moment of full understanding. He doesn't get a scene where Cataleya sits him down and explains her history, her mission, her reasons. He's left in a state of partial knowledge, aware that she's dangerous, aware that she's been lying, but not fully comprehending the scope of what she's been doing or why. That incompleteness mirrors the relationship itself. Dany wanted intimacy with someone who was never truly available for it, and even at the end, he's still on the outside looking in. Agent James Ross, brought to life by Lenny James, embodies the institutional response to individual vengeance. He's not a villain, but he's also not an ally. He represents a system that, in theory, should deliver justice but in practice often fails to hold powerful criminals accountable. Ross's investigation into the orchid killings is methodical and intelligent. He's connecting dots that others have missed, seeing patterns in what looks like chaos. But his pursuit of Cataleya isn't driven by a desire to protect Don Luis or Marco. He knows exactly what kind of men they are. It's driven by a commitment to the rule of law and a belief that vigilante violence, no matter how justified its motivation, undermines the social contract. James plays Ross with a weary intelligence, like a man who's seen enough cases to know that most of them don't have satisfying endings. He's not naive about the limitations of the justice system. He knows that men like Don Lewis operate with a certain degree of impunity, protected by corruption and political expediency. But he also knows that allowing individuals to bypass legal processes and deliver their own justice creates a different kind of chaos. When he finally identifies Cataleya, there's no sense of triumph in his demeanor. If anything, there's sadness. He's looking at someone whose life has been consumed by a quest for revenge, and he knows that stopping her won't undo any of the harm that's already been done. The moral tension between Ross and Cataleya is never resolved in a way that crowns either perspective as correct. He believes in process, in accountability, in the idea that even imperfect justice administered through institutions is preferable to the law of retaliation. She believes that when those institutions fail, and they did fail, spectacularly, to protect her family or hold Don Lewis accountable, then the only recourse is to take matters into your own hands. The film holds both positions without collapsing them into a neat synthesis. Ross is right that her violence perpetuates cycles of harm. Cataleya is right that the system he represents offered her no meaningful path to justice. On the other side of the moral spectrum sits Marco, played by Jordi Mola as a man defined entirely by his function. He's Don Luis's enforcer, the instrument through which the cartel projects its power and eliminates its problem. Mola doesn't humanize Marco in the traditional sense. There are no scenes where we learn about his family, his doubts, his interior life. He's cold, efficient, and utterly lacking in visible remorse for the violence he inflicts. When he kills Cataleya's parents, it's not personal. It's just a job. That detachment makes him more unsettling than a villain who revels in cruelty. He's a reminder that most real-world violence isn't committed by cackling monsters, but by people who've compartmentalized their actions and convinced themselves that they're simply following orders. His final confrontation with Cataleya carries weight not because of anything he says, but because of what he represents. He's the man whose actions set her entire life on its current trajectory. Without him, she might have grown up in Colombia with her family intact, lived an ordinary life, never become an assassin. His death is the fulfillment of a promise she made as a child, but Mola's performance keeps it from feeling triumphant. He fights back with the same professional detachment he's always shown, and when he dies, it's just another body added to a count that's been climbing since the film's opening minutes. One of Colombiana's smartest choices is the casting of Amandla Stenberg as young Cataleya. Stenberg's performance in the film's opening act isn't just competent child acting, it's the blueprint for everything Saldana does later. Watch the way young Cataleya processes her parents' murder. She doesn't scream or collapse into hysterics. She runs, she calculates, she improvises weapons from bathroom fixtures and uses her size as an advantage against larger pursuers. Even at 9, she's already thinking in terms of survival and strategy, rather than succumbing to terror. That precocious lethality makes the adult version of the character believable. We don't need a training montage because we saw where it started, with a child who was already capable of extraordinary focus under unimaginable pressure. The orchid her father showed her, the promise she makes at his deathbed, the way she navigates from Colombia to Chicago alone. All of these establish Cataleya as someone whose response to trauma is to weaponize it rather than be destroyed by it. Stenberg's performance gives us a child who is already beginning the process of becoming Saldana's assassin, and that continuity is crucial for making the character feel like a coherent whole rather than two disconnected performances. Taken together, the ensemble of Colombiana functions less like a traditional supporting cast and more like a constellation of perspectives orbiting a central void. Cataleya is at the center, but she's also defined by absence. The absence of the life she might have lived, the absence of emotional availability, the absence of any identity beyond the mission. The people around her are trying to reach someone who fundamentally isn't there anymore, and their failures to connect with her aren't personal failings. They're the inevitable result of trying to have a relationship with someone who has replaced their entire self with a single, consuming purpose. Olivier Megaton's approach to filming Colombiana operates on a tension between intimacy and spectacle. On one hand, the story demands close attention to Cataleya's psychological state, requiring shots that capture micro-expressions and subtle shifts in body language. On the other, it's an action thriller that needs to deliver kinetic sequences where geography, movement, and threat are immediately legible. Balancing these competing demands is where the film's cinematography, handled by Romain Lecurbus, reveals its strategic choices. The color palette shifts dramatically depending on where the story is set. The Bogotá sequences, particularly the 1992 flashbacks, are saturated with warm tones. Oranges, yellows, deep reds. This isn't just aesthetic. It creates a visual association between Cataleya's past and a kind of heightened intensity, a world where violence erupts suddenly and where survival depends on split-second decisions. The warmth also suggests a certain humanity, a time before her personality was reshaped entirely around vengeance. When these scenes show her parents alive, the warmth feels almost nostalgic, even though we know what's coming. Once the massacre begins, that same warmth takes on a hellish quality, as if the world itself is burning down around her. Chicago, by contrast, is rendered in cooler tones, blues, grays, sterile whites. The urban landscape becomes almost clinical, which mirrors Cataleya's operational mindset. She moves through this city not as someone who lives there, but as someone who uses it. Buildings are obstacles or entry points, streets are routes or escape paths. The cool palette reinforces her emotional distance from the environment and the people in it. Even in scenes with Dany, where the script attempts to inject warmth and connection, the visual language remains somewhat detached, hinting that she's never fully present in those moments. The camera work during infiltration sequences deserves particular attention. Megaton frequently employs handheld cameras that follow Cataleya through tight spaces, air ducts, narrow hallways, cluttered rooms. The instability of the handheld approach creates a sense of immediacy, as if we're right there with her, experiencing the same spatial constraints and physical demand. But there's also a precision to these shots. The camera doesn't wander or lose track of her. It follows her movements with a choreographed fluidity that suggests we're not just observers but participants in her thought process. One recurring visual motif is the use of reflections and layered frames. We frequently see Cataleya through glass, in mirrors, or through doorways that create a frame within the frame. This technique serves multiple functions. On a practical level, it allows the film to show her observing a space before entering it, establishing her habit of reconnaissance and planning. On a symbolic level, it emphasizes her fragmented identity. The woman behind multiple layers of glass is literally separated from the world by barriers she's constructed. The reflections also create a doubling effect, hinting at the split between who she is and who she pretends to be. The editing in Colombiana, primarily executed by Camille Delamar and Carlo Rizzo, makes aggressive choices that divide audiences. During action sequences, the cuts come rapidly, sometimes multiple edits per second, creating a staccato rhythm that mirrors the chaos of combat and pursuit. Critics of this approach argue that it can obscure spatial relationships and make it difficult to follow exactly what's happening in a given moment. Proponents counter that it captures the disorientation of violence, the way fights are experienced as fragments rather than coherent wholes. What's worth examining is how the editing pace shifts depending on context. In moments of preparation, when Cataleya is planning a hit, assembling equipment, or studying her target, the cuts slow dramatically. We're given time to absorb the meticulous nature of her work, to understand that what looks like improvisation during the execution phase is actually the result of hours or days of careful setup. This contrast between slow, deliberate planning and explosive, rapid-fire action creates a rhythm that mirrors her psychology, patience punctuated by sudden, overwhelming force. There's also a strategic use of cross-cutting that builds tension across parallel storylines. As Cataleya infiltrates a location, the film will cut to guards making their rounds, to surveillance systems scanning hallways, to Ross reviewing case files that bring him incrementally closer to identifying her. These interwoven threads create a sense of converging timelines, of multiple forces closing in on a single point of collision. The audience is given information that Cataleya doesn't have. We see the threats she hasn't yet detected, which generates a particular kind of suspense distinct from simple surprise. The treatment of violence itself is revealing. The film doesn't shy away from showing the physical consequences of Cataleya's work, but it also doesn't linger on gore for its own sake. Most kills are framed with a functional efficiency. The action happens, the threat is neutralized, and the camera moves on. This editing choice reinforces the idea that for Cataleya, killing is work rather than catharsis. There's no prolonged savoring of her enemies' deaths, no slow-motion glory shots. It's just another step in a process, and the editing treats it accordingly. Sound in Colombiana operates on multiple registers simultaneously. There's the obvious layer, gunshots, footsteps, breaking glass that grounds the action in physical reality. But there's also a more subtle sonic architecture that shapes how we experience tension and release throughout the narrative. The film uses silence strategically, often dropping out music and ambient noise entirely during critical moments, to focus attention on diegetic sounds, Cataleya's breathing, the creak of a floorboard, the mechanical click of a lock being picked. These moments of near silence are most effective during infiltration sequences. As Cataleya navigates hostile territory, the absence of a dramatic score forces the audience to become hyper-aware of every small sound. We hear the rustle of her clothing as she moves, the faint scrape of metal on metal as she manipulates a tool, the distant conversation of guards who haven't yet noticed her presence. This sonic minimalism creates a different kind of tension than a bombastic score would. It's the tension of holding your breath, of waiting for the single sound that will give her away. When the score does emerge, composed by Nathaniel Micheli, it favors electronic textures over traditional orchestral bombast. There are pulsing bass frequencies that operate almost at a subconscious level, rhythmic patterns that mimic heartbeats or mechanical processes. During action sequences, the music accelerates and intensifies, layering percussive elements that drive the pace forward. But even at its most aggressive, the score maintains a certain coldness, a digital precision that aligns with Cataleya's emotional state. It's music that suggests calculation rather than passion. The film also uses sound to bridge temporal transitions. When the story cuts between past and present, auditory elements often bleed across the edit. A gunshot in 1992. Bogota might echo into a scene set in present-day Chicago, creating a sonic thread that connects Cataleya's past trauma to her current actions. These oral bridges reinforce the idea that she's never truly left that night. Her parents died. It's always playing in the background, a constant frequency that drives everything she does. Dialogue mixing also reveals strategic choices. In scenes where Cataleya is operating undercover or maintaining her Jennifer persona, her voice is mixed slightly lower in relation to background noise, as if even her speech is trying to avoid detection. In moments of confrontation, particularly with Emilio when they argue about her methods, her voice is more prominent in the mix, cutting through ambient sound with a clarity that suggests she's finally letting her true self become audible. The physical environments in Colombiana aren't just backdrops, they're extensions of character psychology and thematic concerns. Cataleya's living spaces, particularly her arrangement within Emilio's compound, are notably Spartan. There's minimal decoration, few personal effects, nothing that suggests she's building a life rather than maintaining a temporary base of operation. The walls are bare. The furniture is functional rather than comfortable. It's a space that could be abandoned in minutes. And that impermanence is the point. She's not invested in creating a home because home is a concept that died with her parents. Contrast that with Emilio's home, which is lived in and full of the accumulated details of family life photos on walls, toys scattered around, the comfortable clutter of people who actually inhabit a space rather than just using it. When the cartel assault destroys this environment, the production design makes the violation visceral. Spaces that represented safety and normalcy become crime scenes, domesticity shattered by the same kind of violence that defined Cataleya's childhood. The visual destruction of Emilio's home mirrors the destruction of the only stability she had left. The various locations Cataleya infiltrates are designed to feel like puzzles made of architecture. High-rise office buildings become vertical mazes with elevators, stairwells, and service ducts that she can navigate if she understands the building's logic. Secure compounds are layered with walls, checkpoints, and monitored zones that create concentric rings of defense. The production design emphasizes the structural complexity of these spaces, making it clear that her success depends on understanding how buildings work, not just where the guards are, but where the air conditioning runs, where the utilities are routed, where the architectural plans might reveal vulnerabilities that security consultants overlooked. Don Luis's compound, the film's primary climactic location, is designed as a fortress that's also a prison. High walls, limited entry points, overlapping fields of surveillance. It's built to keep threats out, but it also traps everyone inside. When Cataleya breaches it, the production design shifts from emphasizing defensive depth to highlighting the claustrophobia of a space where there's nowhere left to run. Hallways become kill zones. Rooms that seem secure become cages. The architecture that was meant to protect Don Luis becomes the stage for his execution. Olivier Megaton came to Colombiana with a specific aesthetic inherited from his work with Luc Besson and developed through films like Transporter 3. His directorial signature involves rapid cutting, kinetic camera movement, and a preference for practical stunts augmented rather than replaced by CGI. In Colombiana, these tendencies are on full display, for better and worse. When Megaton's approach works, it's exhilarating. The sequence where young Cataleya escapes through Bogotá's rooftops and alleyways is a masterclass in sustained tension. The camera follows her at a breakneck pace, weaving through obstacles, dropping into tight spaces, creating a visceral sense of pursuit. You feel the physical demands of her escape, the constant calculation required to stay ahead of adult killers. The direction trusts the stunt work and Stenberg's performance, using the camera to enhance rather than obscure what's happening on screen. However, there are moments where the directorial style undermines clarity. Some fight sequences are edited so rapidly and shot with such chaotic camera movement that it becomes difficult to track who's hitting whom or how the geography of the space relates to the combatants. This isn't necessarily bad filmmaking, it's a deliberate aesthetic choice, but it's one that doesn't work for all viewers. For some, the disorientation is immersive. For others, it's frustrating. Megaton also has a tendency to fetishize the mechanics of violence in ways that can feel at odds with the emotional content of the story. There are shots that linger on weapons being loaded, on gear being assembled, on the physical preparation for violence in a way that seems more interested in the aesthetics of lethality than in what these preparations mean for the character. These moments can create tonal dissonance, pulling us out of Cataleya's emotional reality to admire the surface-level cool of her operational method. Yet there are also sequences where Megaton demonstrates genuine restraint. The aftermath of the massacre at Emilio's home, for instance, is shot with a stillness that allows the horror to register without exploitation. The camera doesn't rush through the space cataloging bodies. It moves slowly, letting us absorb the scale of the loss and the reality that every warning Emilio voiced has been validated in the most brutal way possible. These moments of restraint prove that Megaton is capable of modulating his approach when the material demands it. The question is why he doesn't deploy that restraint more consistently. One of the most persistent visual patterns in Colombiana involves framing Cataleya in relation to barriers, literal and metaphorical. She's frequently shot through windows, behind fences, or across doorways, always with something between her and the camera. This creates a sense of remove, of distance that reinforces her emotional unavailability. We're watching her through layers, never quite getting direct access to her interiority. This technique is particularly prominent in scenes with Dany. When they're together, the blocking and framing often place physical objects between them: a table, a door frame, a piece of furniture. Even in moments of supposed intimacy, there's always something separating them, a visual representation of the emotional and psychological barrier she's constructed. The camera acknowledges that true closeness is impossible given the lies that structure their relationship. Conversely, when Cataleya is alone or operating, those barriers often disappear. The camera gets closer, the framing tighter, the sense of direct observation more immediate. It's as if she's only fully present when she's in assassin mode, when there's no need to perform a civilian identity or maintain the pretense of normalcy. The film's visual language suggests that the most authentic version of Cataleya is the one that emerges when she's preparing to kill. Thresholds, doorways, windows, the edges of rooftops are also recurring visual elements. Cataleya is constantly crossing thresholds, moving from one space to another, never settling. This transience is baked into the cinematography. She enters frames from the edges, exits before scenes fully conclude, exists in a state of perpetual motion. The camera often catches her in transition rather than at rest, reinforcing the idea that she's someone who can't afford to stop moving because stopping means confronting everything she's been running from since childhood. The Cataleya orchid that Cataleya leaves at each crime scene isn't just a narrative device, it's a visual motif that the film returns to repeatedly, each time with slightly different framing and context. Initially, we see it through her eyes as a child, her father explaining its significance. Later, as an adult, we watch her draw it in lipstick, the act ritualistic and deliberate. By the film's end, the orchid has accumulated multiple layers of meaning: signature, memorial, taunt, self-expression. The way these orchids are filmed changes as the story progresses. Early on, they're shot almost clinically, crime scene evidence captured with forensic detachment. As Ross's investigation intensifies, they're shown in collection, multiple images side by side, transforming from individual acts into a pattern that tells a larger story. In the film's final sequences, when the orchid reappears, it's filmed with something close to reverence, acknowledging that this symbol has become inseparable from Cataleya's identity. The production design team created a specific version of the orchid drawing that appears consistent across all the crime scenes, ensuring visual continuity. It's stylized rather than realistic, rendered with clean lines that suggest both artistic intent and the speed with which it must be executed. The choice to use lipstick as the medium is practical. It's something Cataleya can carry without arousing suspicion, but it also adds a layer of gender-coded signification. She's using a traditionally feminine cosmetic product to mark sites of extreme violence, a juxtaposition that underlines how she's weaponized every aspect of her presentation. Next, I'll continue with segment 7, themes and deeper meaning, exploring the film's engagement with trauma, cycles of violence, identity construction, and what Colombiana ultimately argues about: justice and revenge. The most persistent thematic thread running through Colombiana is the question of what trauma does to human development when it arrives at a formative age. Cataleya doesn't experience violence as an adult who has already developed coping mechanisms, moral frameworks, and a stable sense of self. She experiences it at 9 years old, at a stage when identity is still being constructed. The film suggests that this timing is everything. Trauma doesn't just wound her. It becomes the foundation on which her entire personality is built. This isn't a story about someone overcoming trauma or learning to live with it. It's about someone who has reorganized their entire existence around a traumatic event to the point where healing would require dismantling the person they become. Cataleya's skills, her purpose, her daily routines, her relationships, all of it traces back to that night in Bogota. Remove the revenge mission, and what's left? The film never offers a clear answer because Cataleya herself probably doesn't have one. She's constructed an identity so thoroughly oriented toward a single goal that achieving it or abandoning it would both result in a kind of psychological annihilation. The movie also interrogates how societies respond to trauma, particularly for those who fall outside institutional protection. Cataleya's parents were criminals, people operating in illegal spaces. When they're murdered, there's no justice system that mobilizes on their behalf. No one investigates their deaths with any urgency. The institutions that exist to address violence simply don't function for people like them, which means their daughter has to either accept that her parents' murders will go unanswered or step outside the system entirely to address it herself. The film doesn't present this as a straightforward moral choice, but it does acknowledge the reality that institutional justice has borders, and people outside those borders are essentially on their own. What makes Colombiana's treatment of trauma particularly interesting is how it avoids certain cliches. Cataleya doesn't have flashbacks in the middle of missions that compromise her effectiveness. She doesn't break down crying at inopportune moments. Her trauma manifests as hypercompetence, as an almost supernatural ability to compartmentalize and focus. This portrayal cuts against the grain of how trauma is often depicted in cinema, where it typically makes characters vulnerable or unreliable. Here, trauma has made the protagonist more dangerous, more capable, more functional in violent contexts, even as it has destroyed her ability to exist in normal ones. Colombiana engages directly with the idea that violence creates cycles that perpetuate across generations and geography. Don Luis ordered the Restrepo family killed to protect his operation and send a message. That act of violence created Cataleya, who spent 15 years becoming the instrument of his destruction. But her campaign of revenge doesn't end the cycle. It triggers a counterstrike that kills Emilio's family, innocent people who had nothing to do with the original conflict. Each act of violence spawns new victims, new grievances, new potential avengers. The film is clear-eyed about this dynamic without becoming preachy. It doesn't pause the action to have characters deliver speeches about the futility of revenge. Instead, it shows the consequences playing out in real time. Emilio warns Cataleya repeatedly that her actions will have repercussions beyond herself, and he's proven correct in the most devastating way imaginable. Yet the film also doesn't suggest that she should have simply let her parents' murders go unanswered. It presents the cycle without offering easy exits, acknowledging that while revenge might be self-perpetuating and destructive, the alternative, accepting injustice and moving on, requires a kind of surrender that feels psychologically impossible for someone in Cataleya's position. There's also a geopolitical dimension to this theme. The violence that defines Cataleya's life originates in Colombia's drug wars, conflicts fueled by American demand for narcotics, and decades of policy that prioritize criminalization over harm reduction. Don Luis operates in that system, profiting from its existence. When Cataleya pursues him to the United States, she's following the same routes that drugs and money travel, making visible the connections between consumer nations and the violence produced in source country. The film doesn't develop this critique extensively, but it's present in the background. The systems that enabled Don Luis's rise are the same ones that made Cataleya's revenge necessary. The inheritance theme also operates on a personal level. Cataleya's father was himself a criminal, someone who participated in violent systems before trying to exit them. His attempt to leave with information that could damage Don Luis is what triggers the massacre. In that sense, Cataleya inherits not just trauma, but also the consequences of her father's choices. The film doesn't judge Fabio harshly for his past, but it does acknowledge that his involvement in the drug trade created vulnerabilities that ultimately destroyed his family. Cataleya's revenge is thus complicated by the fact that her parents weren't entirely innocent victims. They were people trying to escape a world they'd once participated in. Throughout Colombiana, the question of who Cataleya really is remains persistently ambiguous. Is she the assassin who leaves orchid signatures, the role she's performed for 15 years? Is she the Jennifer persona she adopts with Dany, a fiction constructed to approximate normal human interaction? Is she the terrified 9-year-old who watched her parents die, forever frozen at that moment of trauma? Or is she some combination of all three, a fragmented self that can never be fully integrated? The film explores identity as something constructed rather than discovered. Cataleya didn't find her true calling as an assassin. She built that identity deliberately, piece by piece, skill by skill, because it was the only way to pursue the goal that mattered to her. Every aspect of who she is serves the mission. Her physical training ensures she can infiltrate and escape. Her emotional suppression prevents hesitation or doubt. Her aliases and compartmentalized relationships protect her operational security. There's a ruthless instrumentality to how she's crafted herself, but this raises uncomfortable questions about authenticity. If every part of your personality has been shaped by a single traumatic event and oriented toward a single goal, is that personality authentic, or is it a kind of performance you've been delivering for so long that you've forgotten it's not real? The film never resolves this tension. Cataleya doesn't have a moment of clarity where she recognizes her true self beneath the layers of conditioning and trauma. Instead, she simply continues operating within the identity she's built, suggesting that maybe authenticity is a luxury unavailable to people whose development was interrupted by extreme violence. The contrast with other characters underscores this theme. Emilio has a more integrated identity. He's a criminal, yes, but he's also a husband, a father, a person with dimensions beyond his illegal activities. Dany is exactly who he appears to be, an artist with no hidden layers or secret histories. Marco, meanwhile, represents the endpoint of complete compartmentalization, a man who has so thoroughly separated his professional violence from his personal life that he can execute families without it registering as morally significant. Cataleya exists somewhere between Emilio's integration and Marco's compartmentalization, able to access human connection but never able to fully inhabit it. One of Colombiana's central philosophical questions concerns the relationship between revenge and justice. Are they different names for the same impulse, or are they fundamentally distinct concepts? The film's treatment of law enforcement, particularly through Agent Ross, suggests that institutional justice operates too slowly and too imperfectly to address certain kinds of violence. Don Lewis has government protection. The legal system, compromised by corruption, has failed to hold him accountable for years of criminal activity. If the institutions designed to deliver justice don't function, does the moral weight shift to individuals to pursue it themselves? The film doesn't offer a simple answer. It presents Cataleya's revenge as understandable, even inevitable, given what she's experienced and the complete absence of any legal remedy. But it also doesn't glorify that revenge or pretend it comes without cost. Every person she kills in pursuit of Don Luis and Marco, even those who are themselves criminals, represents a choice to take life, to become judge and executioner without trial or appeal. The orchid signatures she leaves are both memorial and confession, proof that she was there, that she did this, that she wants credit for these deaths. Ross embodies the tension between understanding Cataleya's motivation and recognizing that what she's doing is, legally speaking, serial murder. He can see the pattern, understand the grievance, and still be obligated by his role to stop her. The film respects his position without fully endorsing it. His investigation is presented as competent and necessary, but it's also clearly insufficient as a response to the original injustice. He's trying to enforce laws that were absent when Cataleya needed them most, which creates a moral asymmetry. The film acknowledges, but doesn't resolve. There's also a question of proportionality. Cataleya doesn't just kill Don Luis and Marco. She kills dozens of people, guards, associates, anyone connected to the organization. Some of these people are unquestionably guilty of serious crimes. Others are lower-level operators whose culpability is less clear. The film doesn't pause to interrogate each killing individually, which itself is a choice. It suggests that, from Cataleya's perspective, everyone connected to Don Luis's operation is complicit and therefore a legitimate target. But that perspective collapses moral distinctions in ways that should probably make us uncomfortable, even if we're rooting for her success. Colombiana exists in a complicated relationship with gender politics. On one hand, it presents a female protagonist who is undeniably powerful, capable, and central to every aspect of the narrative. She's not a sidekick or a love interest who occasionally participates in action sequences. She's the engine of the story, and her competence is never questioned or undermined. The film takes her seriously as a threat, as an operator, as someone whose skills command respect and fear from the men around her. On the other hand, the film was written and directed by men, and there are moments where the camera's treatment of Saldaña's body feels more objectifying than character-driven. Certain sequences linger on her physique in ways that seem designed for audience titillation rather than narrative necessity. She's frequently shown in various stages of undress, and while some of these moments serve a purpose, demonstrating her willingness to use every tool at her disposal, including sexuality, others feel less justified by the story and more like exploitation of the actress's marketability. What's interesting is how the character herself weaponizes gender expectations. Cataleya is fully aware that men in her world will underestimate her based on size, strength, and gender. She uses that underestimation tactically. When she plays drunk or helpless, she's exploiting sexist assumptions that women are less capable, less threatening, less dangerous. In those moments, femininity becomes a form of camouflage, something she puts on and takes off as needed. The film is most successful when it's examining this dynamic rather than simply replicating it. The romance with Dany also raises questions about how the film understands female desire and agency. Does Cataleya pursue that relationship because she genuinely wants connection, or because maintaining a semblance of normal life serves as cover for her real activities? The film leaves this ambiguous, which could be read as sophisticated characterization she herself might not know, or as a failure to fully develop her interiority outside of the revenge plot. The fact that Dany is largely a passive figure, someone things happen to, rather than someone who drives the narrative, suggests the romance exists primarily to demonstrate what Cataleya has sacrificed rather than to explore a genuinely mutual relationship. The Cataleya orchid operates as the film's central symbol, accumulating meanings as the narrative progresses. Initially, it's a connection to Cataleya's father and her Colombian heritage, something beautiful and rare, like the daughter he named after it. As she transforms it into her signature, it becomes a calling card, a way of marking territory and claiming credit. By the film's end, it's inseparable from her identity as an assassin, a symbol that represents both who she was and what she's become. Orchids are delicate flowers that require specific conditions to thrive. Remove them from their native environment, and they struggle. The metaphor is almost too obvious. Cataleya, uprooted from Colombia and transplanted to Chicago, exists in a kind of perpetual stasis, unable to truly grow or develop beyond the mission that defines her. She survives, even excels in certain contexts, but she doesn't flourish. The orchid signature thus becomes a reminder of what she's lost, not just her family, but her ability to exist as anything other than an instrument of revenge. There's also an aesthetic dimension worth considering. Orchids are prized for their beauty, but that beauty often involves deception. Many orchid species have evolved to mimic other organisms, insects, other flowers, to attract pollinators. The flower's appearance is a kind of performance designed to serve reproductive goals. Cataleya's life operates on a similar principle. Everything about her public-facing identity is performance designed to serve the singular goal of revenge. The beauty, the charm, the romantic relationship, all of it is camouflage for the violence at her core. The fact that she draws the orchid in lipstick adds another layer. Lipstick is associated with femininity, with conventional beauty standards, with the presentation of self. By using it to mark crime scenes, she's taking something coded as harmless and feminine and transforming it into a declaration of violence. It's a subversion of expectations, much like she is, a woman who looks like she could be a model or an actress, but who is actually one of the most dangerous people in the room. Perhaps the most melancholic theme in Colombiana is its meditation on what happens when you dedicate your entire life to a single goal. Cataleya has achieved extraordinary things through focus and determination. She's mastered skills most people couldn't develop in multiple lifetimes. She's infiltrated supposedly impenetrable locations, eliminated experienced killers, and navigated complex criminal networks. By any measure of competence, she's exceptional. But that exceptionalism has required the sacrifice of everything else. She has no friends, no genuine romantic connections, no hobbies or interests beyond her mission. She's never shown enjoying anything, food, art, music, nature, in a way that isn't instrumental. Her entire existence has been pared down to the essential functions required for revenge, and while that makes her extraordinarily effective, it also makes her life narrow and isolated in ways that seem almost inhuman. The film doesn't present this as a cautionary tale exactly, but it does acknowledge the price. When Emilio and his family are killed, Cataleya is faced with the reality that her single-minded pursuit has destroyed the only people who still cared about her. She achieves her revenge, kills everyone responsible for her parents' deaths, and then what? The film's ambiguous ending reflects that question. She's accomplished what she set out to do, but there's no sense of triumph or completion. There's just the hollow space where purpose used to be. This theme resonates beyond the specifics of the revenge plot. It's a broader meditation on obsession and the tunnel vision that comes with dedicating yourself entirely to one objective. Whether that objective is revenge, career success, artistic achievement, or anything else, the cost is the same. Everything else falls away. Colombiana presents that dynamic in its most extreme form, but the underlying question applies more broadly. What do you have left when you finally achieve the thing you've sacrificed everything for, and it doesn't fill the void you expected it to? We'll move into Segment 8, Cultural Impact, Legacy, and Final Reflections, examining how Colombiana was received, its position within genre evolution, and what it reveals about action cinema's relationship with female protagonists. When Colombiana arrived in theaters in August 2011, it encountered a critical landscape that was simultaneously hungry for diverse action narratives and skeptical of familiar genre formulas. The film opened to a modest 10.3 million domestically in its first weekend, eventually grossing around 37 million in North America and nearly 63 million worldwide. These numbers positioned it as a moderate commercial success, profitable enough to justify its reported 40 million budget, but not a runaway hit that would redefine the action landscape or guarantee sequel. Critical reception split along predictable fault lines. Reviewers who engaged with Colombiana primarily as a genre exercise, a revenge thriller designed to deliver action set pieces and visceral satisfaction, tended to find it competent, if unremarkable. They praised Saldanha's commitment to the physical demands of the role and acknowledged several well-crafted infiltration sequences, while noting that the story itself broke no new ground. For these critics, the film was workmanlike action filmmaking, professionally executed, but lacking the innovation or distinctive voice that elevates genre pieces into something more memorable. Others took a harsher stance, focusing on elements they perceived as deficiency. The editing came under particular scrutiny, with multiple reviewers arguing that Megaton's rapid-cut style obscured rather than enhanced the action choreography. Some found the romance subplot underdeveloped and unconvincing, a box-checking exercise that slowed the film's momentum without adding meaningful emotional depth. The script, co-written by Luc Besson and Robert Mark Kamen, was criticized for relying on revenge thriller conventions without interrogating or subverting them in interesting ways. What's revealing about the critical discourse around Colombiana is what often went unexamined. Few mainstream reviews engaged substantively with the film's treatment of trauma, its ambiguous ending, or its relationship to broader questions about justice and institutional failure. The film was largely assessed on surface-level execution, action choreography, pacing, performance, rather than on the thematic territory it was navigating. This speaks to a tendency within film criticism to approach action thrillers, particularly those centered on female protagonists, as primarily spectacle-driven rather than potentially serious examinations of character and consequence. There were exceptions. Some critics recognized that Colombiana was doing something more nuanced with its protagonist than simply making a female version of a male action archetype. They noted that Cataleya's emotional suppression and single-minded focus weren't presented as empowering but as symptoms of deep psychological damage. Her competence as an assassin comes at the cost of her humanity, and the film doesn't pretend that trade-off is heroic. These readings positioned Colombiana as a bleaker, more melancholic film than its marketing suggested, one that uses action genre conventions to explore what revenge actually costs the people who pursue it. Any discussion of Colombiana's legacy has to grapple with its complicated authorship. Olivier Megaton directed the film, but it was written and produced by Luc Besson, whose creative fingerprints are visible throughout. Besson has spent decades crafting stories about women transformed into weapons, from Nikita in La Femme Nikita to Matilda in Léon, the professional, to the titular character in Lucy. These films share recognizable DNA. Young women experiencing trauma or manipulation that reshapes them into operatives with extraordinary capabilities, often under the tutelage of older male figures. Colombiana fits squarely within this pattern. Cataleya is another entry in Besson's catalog of damaged women who become lethal through necessity and training. The dynamic with Emilio echoes Leon, where a young girl's relationship with an older male assassin shapes her development in morally complicated ways. The focus on physical competence, meticulous planning, and the aestheticization of violence are all Besson hallmark. Even the film's European sensibilities, the way it treats sexuality, the pacing of its quieter moments, the ambiguous morality of its ending, reflect his authorial preferences more than they do typical American action thrillers. This raises questions about auteur theory and collaborative filmmaking. Megaton brings his own visual style and directorial choices to the project, but he's working from Besson's script and under his production oversight. Where does one creator's influence end and the other's begin? The rapid editing and kinetic camera work feel distinctly like Megaton's contribution, consistent with his other films. The character arc, thematic concerns, and narrative structure, however, are unmistakably Besson. The result is a hybrid that belongs fully to neither creator, but carries traces of both. What complicates this further is Besson's controversial personal history and the ways it colors retrospective readings of his films. Stories about young women being shaped by older men, already morally ambiguous, take on different resonance when viewed through the lens of allegations and patterns in the creator's own life. Colombiana can't be separated from these contexts, even though the film itself predates many of the public conversations about Besson's conduct. For contemporary viewers, that biographical knowledge inevitably inflects how they interpret the power dynamics and gender politics within the narrative. Colombiana arrived at a moment when the revenge thriller was experiencing renewed vitality. The success of Taken in 2008 had demonstrated audience appetite for streamlined vengeance narratives with minimal moral complexity. Films like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, both the Swedish original and the American remake, and Kill Bill had shown that female-centered revenge stories could find mainstream audiences. Within this landscape, Colombiana positioned itself as something between exploitation and examination, a film that wanted to deliver the visceral satisfactions of the genre while also acknowledging the psychological cost. Compared to Kill Bill, which embraces stylization and treats revenge as an operatic performance, Colombiana is more grounded and less interested in ironic distance. Tarantino's films are in conversation with genre history, constantly referencing and remixing tropes for knowing audiences. Megaton and Besson's approach is more straightforward. They're playing the revenge thriller relatively straight, without the postmodern winks that characterize Tarantino's work. This makes Colombiana feel more earnest, but also potentially more dated. Where Kill Bill exists somewhat outside time, through its deliberate artificiality, Colombiana is locked into early 2010s action aesthetics. Against Taken and its focus on a father rescuing his daughter, Colombiana offers an inversion, a daughter avenging her parents. But where Taken presents Liam Neeson's Brian Mills as unambiguously heroic, a good man pushed to violence by circumstances, Colombiana is less certain about Cataleya's moral standing. She's not a normal person forced into temporary violence, she's someone who has made violence her identity. The film doesn't ask us to celebrate that transformation the way Taken celebrates Mills's particular set of skills. Instead, it presents her competence as simultaneously impressive and tragic. Within the specifically female revenge thriller subcategory, Colombiana is more action-focused than something like Hard Candy or Promising Young Woman, which centers psychological warfare and moral interrogation. It's closer to Haywire or Atomic Blonde in its emphasis on physical capability and tactical intelligence. But it's also more interested in the interior life of its protagonist than those films, which lean harder into pure action filmmaking. Colombiana wants to be both a showcase for Saldana's physical performance and a character study of obsession, and that dual ambition is part of what makes it interesting even when the execution doesn't fully cohere. To understand Colombiana's cultural position, it's worth contextualizing what the landscape looked like for female action protagonists in 2011. The year saw the release of Sucker Punch, Hannah, and The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, all featuring young women engaged in various forms of combat or survival. Scarlett Johansson's Black Widow was becoming a fan favorite in the MCU, though still relegated to supporting roles. Angelina Jolie, who defined a certain kind of action heroine in the 2000s with films like Salt and Wanted, was moving away from those roles. Into this environment came Zoe Saldana, already recognizable from Avatar and Star Trek, but attempting to anchor an action vehicle as the sole lead. The gamble was whether audiences would accept her in a role that demanded sustained violence and minimal romantic subplot development. Hollywood's conventional wisdom held that female-led action films needed to soften the protagonist's lethality with vulnerability, romance, or maternal instincts. Colombiana includes a romantic element but doesn't center it, and while Cataleya's motivation is rooted in family, it's not maternal but filial. She's not protecting children, she's avenging parents. The film's moderate success suggested there was an audience for this type of story, but perhaps not a large enough one to shift industry calculations dramatically. In the years following Colombiana, we'd see more female-led action films: Mad Max, Fury Road, Atomic Blonde, Wonder Woman, but the genre remained predominantly male-centered. What Colombiana demonstrated was that a mid-budget action thriller with a female lead could be profitable, but it didn't become a template that studios rushed to replicate the way Taken did for male revenge narrative. Part of this might be attributed to the film's unwillingness to make Cataleya easily likable or aspirational. She's not a hero in any conventional sense. She's a serial killer whose targets happen to be other criminals. The film asks us to understand her rather than admire her, which is a more complicated emotional proposition. Audiences typically want action protagonists they can root for without moral ambiguity. Colombiana offers a protagonist whose journey makes sense psychologically but is difficult to celebrate, and that may have limited its broader cultural impact. More than a decade after its release, Colombiana occupies an odd space in the cultural memory. It's not widely remembered as a classic of the revenge thriller genre. It doesn't appear on most lists of essential action films or defining works for its cast and crew. Yet it also hasn't been completely forgotten. It maintains a presence on streaming platforms, finds audiences through cable airings, and occasionally resurfaces in discussions about female action protagonists or Zoe Saldana's career trajectory. This liminal status, neither celebrated nor completely dismissed, might be the most accurate reflection of the film's actual quality and ambition. It's a competently made genre piece that does some interesting things with its protagonist, but doesn't revolutionize the formula or execute it so brilliantly that it becomes the definitive version. It exists in the middle space that most films occupy, well-crafted enough to be worth watching, but not exceptional enough to demand repeated viewing or sustained critical analysis. What's worth preserving about Colombiana, even if it's imperfect, is its willingness to let a female character be driven by rage and obsession without immediately punishing or redeeming her. The film doesn't end with Cataleya learning that revenge is wrong or finding peace through forgiveness. It ends with her having completed her mission and facing an uncertain future, possibly on the run, definitely alone. That refusal to wrap things up neatly or provide easy moral lessons is valuable. It treats revenge not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be examined. The film also deserves recognition for Saldanha's performance, which commits fully to the physical and emotional demands of the role without the safety net of irony or camp. She plays Cataleya seriously, finding the humanity in someone who has deliberately suppressed most of her human emotions. The moments where that suppression cracks, when she looks at her parents' photograph, when she argues with Emilio, when she stands over Marco's body, are where Saldanha does her best work, showing us the person who still exists beneath the weapon she's become. On a broader level, Colombiana functions as a useful text for thinking about why revenge narratives remain so persistently popular, despite, or perhaps because of, their moral complexity. Revenge appeals to a fundamental human desire for proportional response to harm, for the universe to balance scales that unjust actions have tipped. When institutions fail to deliver that balance, when criminals evade consequences and victims receive no justice, revenge fantasies step in to provide catharsis. They let us imagine a world where the guilty actually face punishment and where individual agency can correct systemic failures. The Colombiana also illustrates why revenge is ultimately unsatisfying, even in fantasy. Cataleya gets everything she worked for. She kills everyone responsible for her parents' deaths. She executes her plan with near-perfect precision, and yet the film's ending doesn't feel triumphant. She's still traumatized. Her family is still dead. The people who helped her are now dead too, casualties of her campaign. The revenge delivered exactly what it promised, the deaths of her enemies, but it couldn't deliver what she actually needed, which was a restoration of what she'd lost. No amount of killing can bring back her parents, or give her a normal childhood, or undo the fundamental reshaping of her personality. This gap between what revenge can accomplish, punishment of the guilty, and what victims actually need, restoration and healing, is where the film's melancholy lives. It's honest about the fact that justice and healing aren't the same thing, that achieving one doesn't automatically provide the other. Cataleya gets justice, at least by her own definition, but she doesn't get healing. She probably can't get healing at this point because healing would require becoming someone other than the person she spent 15 years constructing. The film also demonstrates how revenge narratives often displace broader questions about systemic violence onto individual conflicts. The drug trade that enabled Don Luis's operation, the corruption that protected him, the economic forces that keep cartels profitable. None of these structural issues are addressed by Cataleya's campaign. She can kill individual criminals, but she can't dismantle the systems that create them. Her revenge is personal and complete within its own terms, but it's also limited. It doesn't prevent future Don Luises from emerging or future Cataleyas from being created. It's a local resolution to a systemic problem, which is both the appeal and the limitation of the revenge narrative as a genre. In the end, Colombiana is a film about the impossibility of going home. Cataleya can return to Colombia physically, can stand at her parents' graves, can kill the men who destroyed her family, but she can never return to being the person she would have been if that night in Bogota had unfolded differently. The 9-year-old who might have grown up to have a normal life, to pursue ordinary happiness, to exist without violence as the organizing principle of her identity, that person died alongside her parents. What grew in that child's place was something else entirely, functional, capable, dangerous, and profoundly alone. The Cataleya orchid she leaves at each crime scene started as a memorial but ended as a tombstone, not for her victims, but for herself. Each drawing marked another step away from any possibility of a different life, another commitment to a path that leads nowhere except to the completion of the mission. By the time she kills Don Luis and Marco, she's left so many orchids behind that they've become inseparable from her identity. She is the orchid, beautiful and deadly, thriving only in the specific conditions created by trauma and revenge. What makes Colombiana worth revisiting, despite its flaws and its middling critical reception, is its refusal to pretend that revenge provides closure or that justice and healing are equivalent. It's a film that understands the appeal of the revenge fantasy, watching the guilty finally face consequences, while also being honest about the cost. Cataleya wins, if what she's been doing can be called winning. She accomplishes her goal. And then the film has the courage to ask, now what? What do you do when your entire identity has been built around a purpose that no longer exists? How do you live when you become something that can't survive in normal circumstances? These are questions the film fully answers, but they're questions worth asking. In a genre that often treats revenge as straightforwardly cathartic, Colombiana introduces just enough doubt, just enough melancholy to distinguish itself from pure exploitation. It's not a masterpiece. It's not even the best version of the story it's trying to tell. But it's a sincere attempt to grapple with what revenge does to the people who pursue it, and in that sincerity lies its value. The final image we're left with, whether it's Cataleya disappearing into a crowd or sitting alone in an anonymous space, doesn't offer resolution. It offers only the continuation of a life that has been permanently shaped by violence. She'll carry that orchid signature with her forever, a beautiful mark of something terrible, a memorial to everyone she lost and everything she became. In the language of flowers, orchids can symbolize love, beauty, and strength, but they can also represent luxury at a cost. Beauty that requires sacrifice, survival in hostile conditions. Cataleya embodies all of these meanings. She survives. She's beautiful. She's strong. And she's paid for all of it with the only life she'll ever have. Colombiana isn't asking us to admire her or to condemn her. It's asking us to understand how someone becomes what she is, and what it means to spend your entire life preparing for a moment that, when it finally arrives, feels less like victory than like the end of the only story you know how to tell. What comes after that ending is the question the film leaves us with, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. For a revenge thriller, that ambiguity is both its greatest weakness and its most honest gesture. This completes the comprehensive 18,000-word video essay on Colombiana 2011. All 8 segments have been delivered following the universal workflow and American English guidelines, examining the film's narrative structure, character psychology, technical craft, thematic depth, and cultural positioning.